Okay, so here we go. Hi folks, welcome to another edition of My Life with Robert Burns. We're pleased to have you with us. Douglas Mackenzie here with Jim Thompson to have a chat with one of our cronies. Hi Jim.
Hi Douglas, hi everybody.
Today we're joined by a crony from Glasgow University, who's the joint editor of the Robert Burns Encyclopedia. Among many other roles, he's also the chair of Scottish Literature, and he's the principal investigator of the project Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century. Cronies everywhere. To tell us about his life with Robert Burns, please welcome Professor Gerry Carruthers.
Good evening, Douglas. Good evening, Jim.
How are you doing, Gerry?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's marking season at the moment, but I'm also getting a bit of Burns activity in as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, if you've seen these before or you've heard about what we're doing, our first question is always, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
So I'm Gerry Carruthers. I'm Francis Hutchison Professor of Scottish Literature at the University of Glasgow. I'm co-director for the Centre for Robert Burns Studies there, and I'm general editor of the Oxford University Press edition of Robert Burns. And I've got some other Burnsian roles that will no doubt come up in the course of our chat. And apart from my devotion to Burns, I've got a whole stable of other hobby horses. And beyond the academic stuff, I'm particularly fond of playing the guitar and watching football. And that's almost all there is to know about me, apart from some of the detail that we'll no doubt drill into.
Well, the starting point is always, where were you born and brought up?
Well, I was born in Lennoxtown. My parents lived in Glasgow, but Lennoxtown in Stirlingshire really was the maternity hospital for the north of Glasgow in those days. I was born in 1963. And I come in many ways from a typical Glasgow family, but in another sense, the altered dynamic is that I come from an extended Scottish Italian family, which changes everything. And, you know, even more widely than that, I've got forebears from Kirkcudbrightshire, from Donegal, and from Frosinone province in Italy. So I'm a bit of a mongrel. I'm a proud mongrel, I think.
And what was school life like?
School life, I more or less, I think I had a happy childhood and I enjoyed school. I'm not patting myself on the back, but still, if you look at people lecturing in the humanities and the university sector, probably we're in a minority or a smaller group, those of us who went to a comprehensive school, even now. And even though I've got many friends who were privately or publicly educated, who are colleagues and they're great, I'm not making any comment about that. But I suppose what I'm groping towards is the school I went to in Clydebank, where my parents moved because my father was a maintenance fitter in John Brown Engineering. The school I was at there was a very good working class academic school, and I've always been grateful to very fine teachers and a very nurturing environment. I also very much enjoyed my hometown, although I might have been the last generation where, for instance, in my hometown, sectarianism was absolutely in your face in various ways. We were slightly odd in living in tenement houses owned by John Brown Engineering rather than by the council. So the firm owned the houses. And that was quite interesting. My wee playmates were the sons and daughters of work colleagues of my father's, etc. But I remember growing up in Clydebank with a lot of fondness.
So were you a Banky supporter at that time?
Not particularly. I would go to watch, when I was very wee, I would go to watch Peter Sill Juniors. My grandfather Carruthers, who had quite an interesting past, he was 40 years in the Merchant Marine. He was in the Archangel convoy during World War II, which was a really brutal gig. And he loved and played briefly for Peter Sill. So the place we could go to where he and I could cheer for the same team, and my father, my Catholic father, my Protestant grandfather, and my Jewish uncle and myself, we could all go to Peter Sill and shout for the same side. So that was rather nice. And I remember those days with huge fondness, not least because as a 5 or 6 year old, I would get a Macallan at the cafe in Springburn, and I can still almost taste it. It was great.
You're the first person to mention a Macallan on these podcasts, so you maybe better explain, especially for our international audience, what a Macallan was.
Yeah, well, there was different things you could do, where you could have iced drinks with cream soda, lemonade, and ice cream, and your Macallan with your ice cream, your raspberry sauce, and various things. I think as a 5 or a 6 year old, I never entirely inquired into it, and there was also times where I'd have an oyster, particular types of wafer with ice cream. So Macallans, oysters, ice cream drinks, all of that, and they've kind of, I wish I'd paid more attention because I'd make these things for myself. So I'm a wee bit hazy on the precise ingredients, but I still remember the tastes.
Excellent. And what subjects did you do at secondary school?
I tended to do quite a broad range. So I did English, French, history. I was particularly adept at those, I suppose, but I also did biology and chemistry. Slightly a regret. I did O-grade maths and then didn't do the higher because I was doing 5 hires, and then I did economics and modern studies. So I did 7 hires really. And in fact, when I first went to university, because I got an A band 1 in economics, I thought I was going to be an economist. I had a particular liking for economics. And then I didn't fancy it so much halfway through first year at university. And I was getting much more turned on by English studies and by history.
So did that come out while you were at university, or could you see the direction you were going in while you were still at school?
Well, I was particularly good at English and history in any case, but when I discovered economics, because I didn't do the O-grade, I went straight to higher, and I just found I was fascinated with that whole area, and I was pretty good at it. And although I'd always been good at English, I suddenly thought, oh, economics, that's the way I'm going. I also flirted for a while with the idea of maybe being a biochemist because I enjoyed biology. I mean, it's a typical thing when you're 15, 16, 17, you get lots of different dreams, and there's no bad thing about that. And I wasn't really sure. And I even say to my undergraduates at university, don't get too fixated on what you want to become, because you might change ideas. There's a whole world out there. There's a whole different set of career paths. And one of the things I've realized in my own career in many ways, Douglas, is that you end up where you end up, not through any brilliant genius or plans, but a lot of where you end up is to do with accidental things. And that's okay as well. And you bounce around a bit and you find a place, or a place finds you. And I try not to have too many regrets. I mean, when I graduated from university, I was offered 2 potential career paths that I didn't go down. One of those was a commission in the British Army with the Royal Engineers. And if I signed up as a young officer, they would have put me through a second undergraduate degree in engineering. And this was at a time when the Army and others would be looking at the kind of top graduates across the sector, across the UK, and quite rightly trying to talent spot. And the other potential gig I was offered was the diplomatic service, which could have been interesting. I could have ended up in MI6 perhaps, and occasionally think, oh, that might have been interesting, but really no regrets. I never intended to be an academic. I just found myself gradually becoming one. And I look at now at PhD students, some of whom are quite desperate for the academic career, and I find it a wee bit odd because it was always a possibility, but I was always kind of open-minded. What am I going to do? What am I going to be? What am I not going to be? I'm not sure. And my situation was complicated because from the age of 17 to 21 especially, I was playing in bands. And if I'd been given my choice, I would have wanted to play in rock bands and do that. Thank God that never happened, because even then, playing pubs and clubs and stuff, it's a pretty boring life at times, So yeah, it's I am where I am, wherever that is.
So tell us about the career. What happened after university?
So after university, I took a bit of a pause. I was offered a job teaching English in Japan, and I didn't do that. And that's, you know, something, although I don't have many regrets, that might have been interesting to see a different culture. I took a year out and I worked as a labourer in John Brown Engineering when my father was there. I worked as a stock control clerk with the co-op, and I worked as a labourer in a printing firm. And a year later, I thought, well, you know what? I'm actually going to go to university. I went to university, come out as an undergraduate, and again, I had a year where I was playing guitar a lot. And eventually at Clydebank College, they offered me a part-time job for a term when I was 23. You normally had to be 25 to teach in FE colleges. And I did that and I enjoyed that. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this. I enrolled as a teacher at Teacher Training College. I did that for a year. And then I found that I was offered a 3-year PhD scholarship from the Scottish Education Department in the generous days when they still did that. And I thought, well, I may end up going back to school teaching, but I'm getting offered the chance to do postgraduate study. I'll go and do that. So I had a great time down to about the age of 25, 26, a mixture of work, a lot of studies. Probably other people might have played it a wee bit smarter. They wouldn't have had those gaps, but I enjoyed myself.
So what was your PhD subject?
So my PhD was called The Invention of Scottish Literature During the Long 18th Century. And that is really where I encountered Robert Burns, because there were 2 things going on in my PhD. One, I was intensely interested in the Scottish Enlightenment and intellectual history, if you like. And I wanted to trace the way in which the Enlightenment interacted with Scottish literature. And that meant looking at people like David Hume, who remains perhaps my all-time hero in many ways, looking at philosophy, literature, history, all coming together, and looking at the construction of Scottish identity. So I was studying the Enlightenment. I was doing a bunch of writers within that. And the second last chapter of that PhD was Robert Burns, who I knew had to be in there because I had a hunch that Burns, more than anything, was a writer of the Enlightenment. And that's what I argued. But as I studied Robert Burns, I get more and more into him. I was a wee bit resistant to the Scots language in some ways, like a lot of people, even though I'd been brought up in the west of Scotland, speaking a type of Scots, essentially. When I encountered some people who were pushing the study of Scots in academia and elsewhere, no harm to them, often very good people, I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. It was like the Saltire Society. It was middle-class people who'd never spoken Scots in their puff, who were all asserting that this was our national language and that we had this particular version of culture, and I just didn't get it. And so I had a kind of resistance until I get into Robert Burns and just thought, this is absolutely brilliant. He's a great writer. I love the stuff. It wasn't exactly a prejudice against Scots, but a wee bit of a resistance, as I say, Douglas, and that gradually melted, because one of the things that I realised and continue to realise, there's more than one version of Scots, of being Scottish, and too many of the people who try and tell us about Scottish culture and Scottish identity, they've got a set version of it, which largely comes from Hugh MacDiarmid in the 1930s, and this is the way it is. And frankly, that culture was very different from the culture in which I was inculcated in Springburn and Clydebank. And again, I don't want to harp on this, but hovering on that to some extent, that also had to do with religious backgrounds. So there's a whole, and indeed ethnic background with elements of Irishness and Italian in me. There was whole loads of things going on about the claim to what Scottish culture was being preached, as I say, largely by middle-class people, that I thought, no, I'm not sure about that. But I finished the PhD, and by then I was very much going down that road of being an academic. And at 28, I was offered a temporary lectureship at the University of Glasgow I did that. I enjoyed that. And then the thing that happened after that that was very significant for the rest of my career was that I became a British Academy postdoctoral fellow for 2 years, working on the Editing Walter Scott project at the University of Aberdeen. And that got me into editing. That was something else. I thought, well, I'll do this for a couple of years. It's decent pay, it's professional training, but I don't want to be an editor. You know, that's for anoraks. That's getting into the gubbins of things in the way I don't want to. And I ended up being hooked. I always say that, you know, I go into everything short term or as a kind of joke, and it ends up being long term. And all the things I go into half seriously end up becoming reality for me. So, I mean, my late mother would say, you've always got to take things too far, don't you? And I guess that's true. I take things too far.
Well, you told us a wee while ago, though, that you didn't take the playing guitar too far. But I'm sure our audience will be interested to know what kind of music you were playing with the guitar.
Well, the kind of music I was playing then, as I do now, a lot of kind of West Coast 60s American rock. I also still play the folk guitar. I've got 7 guitars here in the house. My pride and joy is a white Fender Stratocaster that I play through my Vox AC30 with blueback speakers. It was an amplifier that was made in 1965. I bought it in the early 80s when only The Jam, one of my favourite groups, was playing these, and it sounds absolutely gorgeous. So I'm a kind of post-60s, post-punk, pop, rock fan, and that's the kind of stuff I love. But I play a bit of jazz and stuff. One of my favourite guitarists is Wes Montgomery. I'm a sucker for guitarists, whether it's Django Reinhardt or Jimi Hendrix. I absolutely adore the guitar. And some of my mates mock me because the other thing I like is 1960s surf instrumental. And on the British side of the Atlantic, I also like the Shadows, however unfashionable that is. So I can play many of their things. And I've even got a pedal that models all of the particular echo sounds on Wonderful Land, Apache, The Frightened City, etc., etc. So I'm an absolute sucker for guitar music. But I recently also bought a drum kit and a new keyboard and a mandolin, which I've always dabbled in. The thing I've never played, and I'm now two things I'm now thinking of getting. It was great when I loved all this stuff and had lots of time. I now don't have the time and I'm buying the stuff, which is a bit perverse. But I would now like to get a banjo and a fiddle, and I probably will before the year is out.
Excellent. Well, I can recommend a great fiddle teacher because we had a podcast with Alistair McCulloch earlier on in the series, and I'm sure he would be interested in talking to you about the fiddle. Anyway, before we finish in talking about you and getting on to the Burn stuff, you talked about other hobbies. You want to tell us something about these?
I've always loved football, especially Scottish football. I can get absorbed, no harm to the clubs, a Brecon Forfar game rather than an English Premiership match. I've always loved Scottish football. I remember as a wee boy sitting shaking, waiting for a big Scotland game coming on, especially Scotland against England. And my father and I, we would sit and watch these things together and eventually go to some of the games. So watching football has been a huge passion throughout my life. I played football down till I was 40, 11s intermittently. I should have kept that or 5-a-sides up because your fitness goes and you don't realise it. I also spent 3 years playing hockey. So hockey and football were my 2 sports, and I still like watching both of those. Apart from that, the obvious thing for a kind of academic geek, I do love reading, especially crime fiction and also true life crime. Something I shouldn't be admitting to an audience of polite people like your audience is I am an amateur ripperologist. In other words, I read everything and anything that comes out related to Jack the Ripper. But I'm very interested in true Scottish crime, especially Antique Smith, the Burns forger, but also things like the Madeline Smith poisoning case, the Oscar Slater case in Glasgow. I'm fascinated by criminology, police techniques, all of that kind of stuff. And some of that I've kind of squeezed into my work on Burns just because I'm an absolute hobbyist. But that whole area of true life crime is utterly fascinating to me.
A pal of Jim's, Douglas Skelton, got a few books out of that, if I remember.
He wrote one on the Darien scheme, if I remember rightly. Would that be right?
No, he did the Darien scheme, and he also did the one about Indian Peter.
That's right. Yeah, I've got that. I've read that. Yeah, indeed.
That's a great book.
Yeah. All the. I mean, it's always fun. I mean, the thing about crime stuff is not just who done it and getting to the end of it. It's about human nature. I like stuff about human nature, and that's certainly an area where you get into that. I've got although I'm on a number of museum boards, I confess I've got a fairly low tolerance for museum experiences. But two places they virtually needed to throw me out was the Titanic experience in Belfast. It was great. And one of my other hobbies, I went to Little Bighorn. I'm obsessed with, or semi-obsessed with, General Custer and the wars with the Sioux in the 1870s. I read everything going on that as well. That's a kind of minor hobby horse.
Well, we've finished with the confessions, so let's get on to Burns again. I know we started a little bit on it earlier on, but I'll pass over to Jim to get a conversation going about Robert Burns.
But all I'm going to say about the crime stuff, Gerry, is it's busman's holiday for me, so you need to give me a class on it. Usually, when we talk to people on this, their first encounter with Burns is either in the family home or at school. Did that not happen to you?
Well, I remember very distinctly, Jim, my first encounter with Burns. My parents, who get married in 1960, had honeymooned in Ayr, because that's what you did in those days. And as a 4-year-old, they took me to Burns Cottage. And I knew nothing about Burns. Why would you as a 4-year-old? My parents wanted to go there. And it did kind of stick in my mind. I don't even mean in any profound way. I was just taken by the cottage and the images of this man. And I knew there was something going on. And that sort of memory lay dormant. And then I had virtually no encounter with Burns until the next time I really remember thinking about Burns in any way was my father was very much a trade union man. And he had various pals who would pop in, or I would go and visit them with him. And a lot of these guys were strong Labour Party men, or in some cases even communists. And I began to notice that they had Burns, and I would hear bits of conversation about that. And even when I was in first year at university doing English, some of Father's friends would say, "So what about Burns?" And I would say, well, interesting, but we're not really doing Burns. But at university, insofar as I encountered Burns, because I avoided Scottish literature as an undergraduate, which is another terrible confession, I did come up against or came into contact with Holy Willie's Prayer and realised this is a great dramatic monologue. And also To a Louse, I realised was great stuff. So my experience of Burns was quite intermittent. It was kind of there in the kind of family political background a wee bit, but not to a huge degree. And it was gradual and piecemeal. The other thing, because I'm still in confessional mode, I suppose, coming from a Catholic background, I, like others, felt that Burns didn't belong to us. And this is really weird historically. And actually, if you like, both the Papists and the Proddies are to blame for this, because the Catholics, for a long time, and even now I hear it, they kind of take the view, oh, Burns isn't for us. And there's also a part of the Burns movement, and the Burns movement is very variegated, where, I mean, I remember going to the first Burns conference, I think, at the University of Strathclyde in 1990, where there were Burnsians insisting that always Burnsians should be good Protestants willing to toast the Queen. As it happens, I'm a Republican, which has got sod all to do with religion. It's simply my political outlook. But you've got all these versions been made by Protestants or Catholics. This is for us, this isn't for us. And ultimately, it's really narrow and it's really daft. And I realised, though, that in a way I was kind of a wee bit of a victim of that. So years later, I wrote a piece for the Scottish Catholic Observer on Burns's Catholic friends in Dumfriesshire. And that would include, for instance, Dr. William Maxwell. It would include correspondence with Bishop John Geddes. There's a whole bunch of these guys. And so I put that piece out there and I thought, well, that'll show some of the Catholics that, you know, Burns is for them, etc. And then I took a phone call from a journalist in the Vatican and he said, you're in trouble in Croy. All right, what's that? And it was a semi-jocular, semi-serious. And apparently in Croy, bless them, they always have a Tommy Burns supper. And that's great. And Tommy Burns was great. I love Tommy Burns dearly. But again, I thought this attitude is still here, that Robert Burns isn't for us. And it's a real shame because I know a lot of Catholic Burnsians, for instance, my friend, known to many of you, Len Murray, the lawyer, a lot of Catholics who've been Burnsians, who love Burns. And there's weird historical things have happened where people on both sides of that religious divide have got the wrong idea about Burns. And it's ultimately a bit laughable. But some of those circumstances bounced me around a wee bit. And so my path into and through Burns is when it's circuitous. One of the stories I always quote is Dumbarton, where Burns was made a burgess in, I think, 1788. And there was a placard on the Earl of Glencairn's townhouse, as was, and it commemorated Burns's visit to Dumbarton. And some presumably Celtic supporting youth had vandalised it with a compass and mason. And it's one of those things in the west of Scotland that's kind of funny, but it's also tragic. And I'm glad to see that since then the council have replaced that. But that's speaking into those misapprehensions about what a mason is and about what Burns's religion might have been and how he relates to modern day society. And, you know, you get a lot of this. I mean, I met one Burnsian, not his first editor, but the latter day Burnsian, the minister James Curry, for instance, who was also sort of chaplain to Rangers, insisting Burns would have been a Rangers fan. It's all a bit daft. You know, it's about, would Burns have voted yes or no? What team would he have supported? All these people quite seriously, you know, and I've had a few Burnsians tell me, oh, Burns would have been a Rangers fan. Yeah, where the hell does that come from? You know, what are the assumptions that are playing into that? And you're entitled to do what you want to do with these things, but you know, it all gets a bit funny. And you know, one of the kind of generalisms I believe about Burns, and I'm kind of preaching to the converted here, I think, with the, you know, with you two gents, and probably with anyone who watches this who's part of this, Burns is genuinely a great poet of humanity. It's a cliche, but it's true because he has got a sympathy with all colours, all creeds, all genders, all kinds of people. So any of our groups who try and hive him off for them, or any of our groups of people who say Burns isn't for me, they're doing themselves a disservice. You're entitled to like or dislike things, but you're not entitled to kind of blot out the truth. And my wee story about that is about 10 years ago, I was away on a picnic with some friends, and I took a phone call from an English so-called quality newspaper, and they said, Jeremy Paxman is saying that Burns wrote Doggerel. What do you think of that? I said, well, it's rubbish. I said, he's entitled to like Burns or not, but he can't speak rubbish because that is simply rubbish. He said, could you write a 200 word, well, I think it was 300 words for us tomorrow? I said, no, I'm in Argyllshire on a picnic. I've got no meat. Could you go into a hotel and see if you could borrow a computer and email us a piece? So I said, okay. So I went in and I wrote 300 words why Paxman was talking utter rubbish, which he was. The next day, the paper comes out. I think it was the Telegraph. And the headline was something like, Scots incensed by Paxman. I wasn't particularly incensed. I was away on a picnic until they harassed me into writing this piece. But they wanted a stair he'd rami, a stushy. And then there were various attempts to set me up in a debate with Paxman. I said, I'll happily do that, but he would never take the bait. And as far as I was concerned, I was going to have a reasonable debate. but it was just never for happening. And again, as anyone listening to me just now, I suspect knows, the amount of absolute rubbish that's spoken about Burns, and I do get passionate and I get angry about this. Burns has always had a lot of chancers around him, and indeed fraudsters and even criminals. And we need to kind of call that out, because you know, I always think back, people trying to make phony claims about poems that Burns wrote that he clearly didn't. I think back to the mates that my father had, all good socialist guys, who, some of whom swallowed some of that stuff because they took it in good faith. Why wouldn't you? And their abuse, their good faith, sorry, was being abused. And that still riles me, I have to say.
Really interesting stuff here. And I don't want to go too deep in because we've got a lot to cover. But if we leave the academic Burns aside, what other involvement you got with Burns in terms of just daily life?
Well, I'm pleased to say, Jim, that there's a number of active things. I'm secretary to the board at Ellisland now, and that's been a very enjoyable thing that I've been working on with a bunch of good folk. I was speaking a bit about that on German radio today. I'll be filming the week after next on that. I'm down for 2 days at Ellisland this week because it's such an important, special place, and we need to get it properly afloat. It's always been fragile. It's always had good people trying to keep it running. It's never had proper core funding. So we've got a number of grants, and we're trying to expand that funding and make it into a proper heritage attraction. I'm also honorary advisor to the National Trust for Scotland's on Burns. That's been a real pleasure. And what I want to do there is hopefully develop some heritage trails around NTS houses in the Highlands and elsewhere, and push some of that, some of the places that Burns went to on his tours. I'm also involved currently as convener of Burns Scotland, although I'll be stepping down next month. And that is various local authorities, including East Ayrshire, including Dumfries and Galloway, including North Ayrshire, and the national galleries, the national museums, etc. Anyone with Burns collections trying to work together. So I've enjoyed that, but it's time for me to move on. So I've had a number of Burns involvements there that have been, you know, a real pleasure. In terms of the wider Burns movement, I'm very honoured to be an honorary member of Irvine Burns Club, of the Burns Club of Atlanta, and I'm currently honorary president of Greenock Burns Club, having done the Immortal Memory this year. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on. That Burns, you know, through my life is a constant. I'm working just now with other members of the team, including at least one person from New Cumnock, with Rona Brown, and with others of our colleagues. We're doing the 4 volumes of Correspondence, both sides, letters to and from Burns, for Oxford University Press. And I've been working away, although it's taken a number of years, editing the 2 volumes of poetry for that. So I've got so many Burns involvements, and at the risk of being a wee bit tedious, the other one I really should mention, we are getting a lab in the Advanced Research Centre, which will open at the University of Glasgow next year, where we work on manuscript forgery and a number of digital and other projects. So we've combined with chemists to do that work that we're going to take forward. And it's been a pleasure. You can do anything with Burns. I co-supervised a PhD on Burns and mental health with the Professor of Psychiatry. So there's a lot of combinations with Burns. And what I love is, you know, great poet, is also a great songwriter. The musical side is very important. And that's one of our potential ambitions at Ellisland, maybe to make it a centre for historic and even contemporary song and songwriting, because it's got such a powerful Burns songwriting legacy. So those are, I suppose, those are probably enough to begin on with. Those are my various Burns involvements.
We had a great session the other night over Zoom, where we featured Ellisland. Colin McNally's a member of our club, and Colin was looking for some feedback on what people had, what their experiences of Ellisland had been like.
Yeah.
And we got Rose Byers and her mum Sarah to come
Yeah.
along. Rose gave us a few songs, and we had a good chat about what Ellisland could be, and how people interpret it in their own mind. So that was really useful. It was a really enjoyable night.
Yeah, I'll see Colin, I think, on Friday. I'll see Sarah as well. And Rose is wonderful as our youth ambassador. Rose, smashing performer. And it's, you know, one of the things I think we're previously talking about was memorable Burn suppers. And I've been at a couple of the Brigton Burn supper. Indeed, I gave the Immortal Memory in 2020. But one of the things they would have very often would be the young performers, primary kids. And you would think, oh, they're going to recite, they're going to sing. We've all got to be enthusiastic. They're trying hard, but they actually get up and perform, and they blow you away. The standard is astonishing. It's genuinely good. A, because they're good, and B, you're reminded at that point just how bloody good Burns is. So you just think, you know, wow. And it's at points like that where I feel very lucky to be involved with Burns in general.
Right, the kid, I don't know how many years I've been going to schools competition, the federation, you know, the national competition, and the quality is unbelievable. And a lot of them are now obviously in adult life and part of entertaining folk like me, you know, all the time. And the Brigton, I'm glad that Brigton have come back. You know, for years they weren't in, you know, they weren't involved in terms of, but some of these young children from the East End of Glasgow in particular are just special.
They really are, Jim. And, you know, one of the things that I've always believed, and I think people have discovered more than ever during the pandemic, is that culture is essential to our well-being. You know, it's not all just about practical things. I'm not sure practical things really exist. Everything is kind of constructed. We decide that, you know, even brain surgery, we decide brain surgery is good because we've decided it's good. Everything is what we decide. There's nothing that's necessarily more useful than anything else. Although if I need a brain operation, I don't want a Burnsian operating on me. I would rather have a brain surgeon. But that said, culture, well-being, museums, literature, recital, and what you're saying, Jim, about these young kids, you see these young kids, I mean, because I've seen the likes of Leslie MacDonald and our committee and the great work they do. These wee kids, even if they don't win the contest, the confidence that is boosted by taking part and getting their certificate, quite rightly. And these are important moments in people's lives where their confidence, where their identity is positively enhanced. And that's one of the things I really admire about the Burns Federation and the Burns movement generally, where it's doing great stuff to instill cultural confidence, cultural performance in people, because we don't have enough of that. We're losing a lot of that old culture to some extent, and it is really, really important.
As a kid, I remember, you know, family dues, New Year, whatever, you were doing your wee turn, right? And that kind of thing has been lost. My children certainly never get involved in that, and my grandchildren have never been involved in that. But to be honest with you, standing there watching a 12-year-old stand in front of 500 or 600 people and recite or sing or play an instrument, I don't know how that cannot boost their confidence for everything in life, not just performing in front of people.
I think that's spot on, Jim. Excuse me. I think that's spot on. You know, one of the reasons we're really stupid when we cut back musical tuition in schools, it's not just about learning an instrument and that's a useless thing. A, it isn't a useless thing, and B, we know that the kind of learning, both physical and mental processes involved in a musical instrument or music does all kinds of other cognitive things that improve thinking and the intellect and also the emotions generally. These are the kind of things that we need to grasp in society, and it's one of the reasons I'm so keen to be involved. For instance, in the moment, I'm on the research and ethics panel of Paisley Museum Reimagined, and I love that project because they're rethinking what's going to happen when that museum reopens in a couple of years. and very much speaking to all kinds of groups in Paisley and its surroundings, and saying to the folk, this is your history, your culture. It's not the museums, it's not the universities. This belongs to everyone, and we all need to buy into that. Culture is for us all. Too often, from the 19th century onwards, but probably before that, we've got this notion of high culture and things like classical music, and you know, oh, that's not for your group or you. It's all there for all of us, because we're all human beings. And again, one of the things I love about Burns, the folk tradition is great, but the classical tradition is brilliant as well. We've got Haydn, we've got Beethoven, we've got Arvo Pärt, we've got Scotland's greatest composer at the moment, Jimmy McMillan. All of these guys have provided settings for Burns. And that proves to me, again, a kind of universality, that the classical dudes get it, the folk dudes get it, even the pop music dudes get it. Culture is for us all. And I always think it's a crying shame when people think, no, poetry, that's for highfalutin people, or music or art or any of that. We need properly to get a democratized mentality that says it's for everyone. It's not just about privilege. It's not closed off. Because again, something I'm passionate about, coming from a working class background, I would grow up with a lot of good people, but quite often as well, you know, and I would see this at my school as a second or third year, a lot of boys who basically regarded education as a waste of time or had a certain contempt for it. And you wonder where that's coming from. I remember about 10 years ago going out to speak about Burns to a bunch of primary twos in a primary school in the Garngad in the north of Glasgow. Pretty rough place, you know, economically deprived. And although it's quite a tough gig, there's some subjects with Burns you shouldn't get onto with primary twos. It was a real pleasure. And just, if you did it the right way, the enthusiasm of the kids. And I remember at the time thinking, these wee 6-year-olds, they're open to anything. But I bet you half of these, at least in another 8-9 years, will be cynical and too cool for school. What is it we're doing wrong that they're open to everything just now, and later on their minds get a bit closed? Is that their fault, or is that our fault? You know, speaking about society widely. And one thing, a much maligned man, and I would join in some of that, but Tony Blair's idea of education is spot on. And we're still not getting that properly calibrated in Scotland, in the UK. Education, and the other thing that sets me off almost daily, is I cannot believe the amount of poverty in our country, and food banks and child poverty really rubs me up the wrong way. There's no excuse for child poverty in a country as rich as ours, and it goes on. And of course, that's part of the reason also that some of these poor kids don't have the energy, the stamina for education. They're behind from the beginning of that poverty trail, and they end up staying behind. And it's appallingly scandalous.
I certainly agree with that.
And the unfortunate thing is, it's no seen. And speaking as someone who's worked with it all his life, in terms of, I mean, I used to see, when I was a young detective, you saw it daily. It was terrible, and it has never changed. And it doesn't matter what the political situation has been in the country. It's always been there, and it still is. And it's just, to me, it's a national shame.
Absolutely, Jim. And you know, that's where occasionally I think, what's the point of politics? I mean, the poverty gap, which has been widening since the 80s, has not been effectively bridged. Whether that's been Labour dominant in Scotland or the SNP or whatever, there's something we're not getting right. That, as you say, none of the political parties are getting right. And I guess that's part of the reason I'm not a member of any political party.
Yeah, but in the 70s, the Scottish Tories were, I mean, the Tory party was pretty dominant in Scotland at one stage. And it was there then, and it's still there now. We could talk about this all day, we'll never cure the world.
Yeah.
Let's get back on to talking about your big project, your editing Burns for the 21st century. Can you give us a wee summary of that for the audience?
Yeah, so 4 volumes have come out already. The first volume was prose, more or less, and that's commonplace books, tour journals, miscellaneous prose, edited by Nigel Leask, who is Regis Chair of English Literature at Glasgow. Volumes 2 and 3 were the Scots Musical Museum, edited by Murray Pittock, who's Vice Principal at the University of Glasgow. So we've got friends in high places. Volume 4, which came out just a couple of months ago, Songs for George Thomson. So following on from James Johnson, the editor, Burns's other great editor, George Thomson, edited by Professor Kirstine McHugh. So that's 4 volumes. As I mentioned, we're doing 4 volumes of the letters. I'll be doing 2 volumes of the poetry and song again. Song will be repeated in the poetry volumes, as it were. And at the moment, I'm working on the Oxford Handbook of Robert Burns, which has got 41 essays, 272,000 words now, I think it is. And that will be going to the press in October. That's the biggest collection of criticism that will ever have been published on Robert Burns. And my idea originally was that I would have that volume tracking the edition, which it has done to a large extent, but it will be out before the correspondence, before the poetry. And that's just the way the world goes sometimes. That whole edition will eventually be available online. And in fact, we can wire it up better eventually, hopefully, when it's online. But the edition has been powered by £2 million from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And I'm always very proud about the fact that that's a British funding council, not just a Scottish one, that has recognised Robert Burns, and the referees who sat adjudicating those grant bids were probably from English universities, and they decided that Burns was important and needed to be invested in. And we also promised a range of other things that you can see on our website, Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century. Specially commissioned song performances, symposia, some spoken word stuff, a documentary on Antique Smith, various databases of manuscripts, and what I've also promised, which we've now begun to make, 4 documentaries, mini documentaries that will be online on Burns and forgery, on editing Burns's poetry, on editing Burns's song, and on editing Burns's correspondence, so that we take the public, as it were, inside the nuts and bolts of what we do when we edit, because the HRC, government funded, who have given us this money, quite rightly insist that there should be transparency, and that someone more or less off the street, coming off the street on their computer, get onto the website, should be able to get a pretty good idea of what we are doing and hopefully why it is worthwhile. So this is going to amount to 11 volumes, a whole load of online resources, a whole load of discussion, symposia, partnership. And so at the end of the project next year, although the volumes will still take a while to come out, that will amount to conversations with hundreds and hundreds of people, dozens of organizations, and we'll be in a position where we've edited Burns more thoroughly than any previous edition, because we've had more manuscripts, more printed books, more information, more help. And what I've kind of enjoyed, which, to be honest, although, you know, I bang on about not necessarily being someone who plans all that much, something I realised really 20 years ago when I was a young lecturer at Strathclyde, and I worked with Ken Simpson, who established the Burns Conference there, was a kind of distrust between academe and the Burns movement. And bits of academe were really snooty towards the Burns movement, and bits of the Burns movement had an inverted snobbery towards academe. And I thought, you know what, we're kind of potentially allies here, and I've worked quite hard to try and reach out to the wider Burns movement and say, can we have a bit of partnership here? And actually, we at the Centre for Robert Burns Studies, which I established in 2007, we've had all kinds of partnership with Burns clubs, with the Federation, with Burnsians, lots of friendships with the clubs and individuals. And by and large, I think that has been successful, although there always remains, as in anything, you've got your snipers, both in academe and in the Burns movement. But what do? You get on with it, because most people are pretty decent and pretty willing to sit down and do business with you and have a dialogue. And that, I have to say, that really has quite turned me on, because that was one of my aims that I think has worked out. You know, there might be people sitting there going, guy's deluding himself. He thinks he's on side with us. But, you know, that kind of partnership between academe and the wider Burns movement, I think we've had some success there. Because, you know, literally every week I'm on the phone to Burnsians or emailing or having chat, and they're telling me stuff. They're bringing me information, and I'm trying to give them bits of information, and it has genuinely been a good partnership.
Brilliant. We're getting close to the end of our time, but one of the things I would like to ask you is, given all of that work you've done on reading Burns documents and letters and poems and such like, you must have some favourite verses or some favourite characters. Is that correct? Have you got some favourites?
Yeah, I mean, the poem that I find very moving is the poet's welcome to his love-begotten daughter. And what turns me on about that is, you know, you can look at any number of texts where Burns, if you like, is iconoclastic, is anti-establishment. But what he's saying in that poem is, I love my daughter, this wee baby, and her mother. And I don't care that anyone says she's illegitimate or I've been fornicating. And it seems to me to be very sincere on Burns's part. All that matters is I love that wee girl. That's one of the few Burns poems that I suppose can make me cry. But I love so many of the texts. And basically, I'm obsessed with the vision, which is quite a weird one maybe to be obsessed with. That's because he's riffing on Ossian. He's referring to James Thomson. A lot of good guys called Jim Thompson. And he's referring also implicitly to Alan Ramsey and Robert Ferguson. In other words, it's all his influences coming together. It's a kind of Frankenstein's monster. But there's a whole bunch of poems and songs that are favourites. And the one that I think Burns maybe didn't write, but I'm open to it, that I'm kind of obsessed with, is The Tree of Liberty, because I want to know the truth. There are lots of mysteries that remain. And there's a lot of episodes in his life. And currently what I'm really turned on by, for obvious reasons, is the period 1788 to 91, when he's at Ellie's Lands, and where he's involved not only in international politics, the French Revolution, etc., but involved in borough politics. And he's hanging out with Robert Riddle at Friars Carse. He's virtually his partner in terms of writing songs and exploring history. All of these aspects. And, you know, it's at that point at Ellie's Land that his Highland writing goes into overdrive. He's in the south of Scotland, but for various reasons, he's thinking of the Highlands. He's, you know, getting very imaginative because he's turned on by the landscape. So all of these things, and I would also like to in future maybe do a bit more work on Highland Mary, because there are mysteries there that remain to be solved, and we might never get to the bottom of them. But all of those kind of things are utterly compelling. I'm writing a book at the moment. It's been going on maybe too long, and it'll be finished over the next couple of years. It's called Robert Burns, Patronage, Fraternity and the People. And that covers all my interests in the sense that it's Burns and his various fraternal mates. That's Freemasonry, it's the Excise Service, it's even the Dumfries Volunteers. It's patronage, because I'm obsessed with his relationship to Presbyterianism, to the moderate Presbyterians, and his enemy, the more hardline Calvinists. And I'm also interested in patronage in that sense, church patronage, but also the way in which he was very good, quite rightly, at getting patronage from other people, both as a writer and in his wider career. So I'm rambling on here because there's so much that I love about Robert Burns, and also the songs. You know, I remember a few years ago, I did the Immortal Memory quite a number of years ago at the Largs Crony Club, and they put me in a taxi at 4:30 in the morning, and I had a meeting in Edinburgh at 9 o'clock, and I made the meeting. And the way in which I made the meeting was I came back home and I sat there and poured some more whiskey, and I listened to a bunch of Burns songs. And the one that did it for me at that point, and there's a lot of performances, was Ronnie Brown doing the original tune for Auld Lang Syne, and that was just lovely. Burns still turns me on, and therefore I'm a very, very lucky man.
And you finishing off there with Auld Lang Syne gets us back to Ellersland again.
Exactly, because that's one of the greatest hits at Ellisland. You know, Burns, no one's ever quite precisely pinned this down. Something like about 130 songs that he writes there. If you look at his output in general, it might be as high as 27%, depending on how you count it, of his entire output in those 3 years. So Burns at the peak of his creativity. And that's another reason, one of many, that I'm delighted to be involved at Ellisland.
Jim, we're nearly at the end of our time. Is there anything else that you want to ask Gerry before we finish off?
Just one question, Gerry. The correspondence volume, when will we be able to get that?
Well, I'm hoping, Jim, that volume 1 and 2 of the correspondence, so in other words, half of the correspondence, I'm going to be meeting the team next month. So I hope none of them are seeing this before it. It won't be a big surprise. I'm saying to them, I want volume 1 and 2 finished by February next year, which will then go to the press. It will take a number of months to be produced and proofread and all of that. I want volume 1 and 2 out in the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. It sounds a long way away, but you know, it never is, as we know. And then volumes 3 and 4 will hopefully happen roughly 18 months after that. And in the meantime, I'm working on the poetry. It's been quite slow, but we've got 4 out of 10 volumes of text already out. And the 11th volume, as I say, is the Oxford Handbook, which should be out next year in 2022. And that's a huge compendium of Burns criticism. So I hope that that will satisfy people while they're waiting on the first 2 volumes of correspondence, roughly a year after the handbook. That's the plan anyway. And we should be good for that, I think.
Good. That's just something I'm looking forward to.
Thanks, great.
Yeah, I think everybody will look forward to that. Certainly, I listened to Kirsten's stuff earlier on in the year. I mean, that was fascinating. So if the rest of the project produces stuff like that, it's going to be fantastic. And we could have talked to you all night, Gerry, and perhaps we can get you to come back on at some point and give us a progress update and what's happening.
Be delighted, Douglas.
Yeah, but in the meantime, just want to say thanks very much for giving your time and telling us about your life with Robert Burns. Thanks, Gerry.
A pleasure. Thanks, Douglas. Thanks, Jim. Take care.